The Sage and the Butcher. There lived a king in the days of yore. He had everything that eyes could desire and the heart could wish for. The only thing he didn't have was a child, someone who would make him happy and make him smile. Now, in the same town, there lived a sage who claimed he spoke to God. Every morning, he went on to the mountain top and had a word with the Lord. As the news spread about the sage and his conversations with God, the king sent a messenger to escort the sage to his palatial abode. The king served him food and washed his feet, and then he sat on the floor and began to weep. "O king," said the sage, "you have everything: a good wife and a lovely home. I do not see you in need or in want of anything more." The king sobbed louder and said, "Yes, I have everything, but what shall I do with it? 'Cause it's a child that makes a home, and without one, I'm alone." The sage smiled and said, "Don't worry, your wish will be in your arms, and your sorrow will soon be gone." Days passed into weeks, and weeks into months, and months into a year, but the king's arms were empty, and no child was born. The king's misery began to grow. He wanted to see, and he wanted to know the reason behind this unfortunate streak that made him sob and made him weep. So he went looking for the sage once more, over the hills and to the mountains near the shore. Soon he saw the sage, lost in meditation, and waited long for his exhortation. Once the sage opened his eyes, he saw the king and recognized, "O king, I know what brings you here. The next time I speak to God, I'll ask him for an explanation for this strange happenstance." The next morning, when the sage spoke to God, he said, "My Lord, I have prayed night and day for this king and queen to bear a child, but his wish is still unfulfilled, and I must add, it's been a while." The god smiled and said, "My dear man, unfortunately, when I wrote his destiny, I didn't write a child for him. He may seek happiness in other things." The sage replied, "You are the master of mankind. As you will, so be it." He passed the message to the king on the same day by late evening. The king's world came crashing down, but he listened and bore the burden on his crown. Now every year the king held a feast for the downtrodden and the weak. To this people gathered in plenty, some to savor, some to eat. Among the people was a butcher who had a large family to feed. His wife, his children, they were all in need. The butcher was new to the town. He didn't know why the king didn't smile and always frown. After the feast, he went to thank the king for his hospitality. He said he didn't know how to repay the king's generosity. The king said, "If you can do anything for me, then pray that I have a child, a blossom in my garden. That'll be the reason for my smile." The butcher raised his hands as high up as he could and asked the Almighty to bless the king, and he knew his good Lord would. 'Cause within that year the queen bore a handsome and cheerful son, who was a little naughty and a little fun. The news baffled the sage, and he went marching up the mountain to ask God, how could this happen? He wondered how God could have gone back on his own words. He himself had said that the king was not destined to be a father in this world. The god was delighted to see his favorite man. He said, I have the answer you're looking for. But before that, can you get me human meat? That too, raw. The sage was taken aback by this wish, but bowed and said, Lord, as you wish. He went with the bowl around the village, asking people to lend their flesh. The people wondered what was wrong with the sage. They said he had surely lost his head. They shut their doors on his face and returned to their work, amused by this insane request. From dawn to dusk, the sage roamed the earth, asking people to fulfill God's word. But no one seemed to care for what he said. They pitied him and offered him bread. The sage was disheartened and totally lost. He wondered how he would face his Lord. Soon his eyes fell on the butcher's home. His children were playing in dirt and filth. His wife was cooking on a wooden plinth. He sat watching the ordinary folk and seemed to have forgotten his need for flesh. When the butcher came running to greet the sage with folded hands and blood stains on his chest, he asked the sage what he could do for him. And the sage said, It's a simple thing. I want some human flesh for my Lord. Can you help me with this cause? The butcher smiled and said, I'm willing to give my master what already belongs to him. Just tell me which part of my body and I'll chop up in a blink. The sage stood stunned and couldn't find words or the courage to speak. His throat went dry as beads of perspiration rolled down his cheeks. He watched the butcher cut himself to pieces and fill his bowl with blood and flesh from all parts of his soul. The sage's hands began to tremble as he ran with the bowl on top of the mountain to hear the story unfold. He knew it wasn't the time to meet God, but he wanted his answers and he couldn't wait any long. As he reached his destination, panting and sweating, he heard his master's voice, calming and soothing. The sage began by saying, Oh master, there was none but the butcher who laid down his life. I just had to tell him, and he did what was right. God laughed loudly and said, How strange it is. I had asked only for flesh. You could have given me then and there. There was no need for you to run around showing how much you care. You forgot that you are human too. What the butcher did, so could you. Now tell me how I cannot answer his prayer when he hasn't even seen me and still believes I'm there. As for his life, I give it back to him. When he gets up, he won't remember a thing. I remember my father telling me this. It's a story I always repeat and cherish. You do not need to tell the world that God exists. Have an open heart and simply persist. Every little thing will fall in place if you believe in God and His mighty grace.